So I'm Noah Simblist, Associate Professor of Art here at SMU, and this is Teddy Cruz, who's here visiting. And this is just going to be a short, casual conversation with a few questions. So one thing that I was curious about is that you teach at UCSD in an art department, and your background is as an architect. And I'm wondering how you think about this relationship between art and architecture.
First of all, I'm happy that I came into UCSD in exile almost, leaving the School of Architecture, which, to tell the truth, at times I miss it, obviously, because there is a more collaborative spirit at times. Mm-hmm. Obviously, architects, well educated in the context of designing objects and artifacts and so on, mm-hmm. There is still a kind of tradition of problem solving that enables mm-hmm. a more collective way of thinking and addressing mm-hmm. very important issues and mm-hmm. So on. So in terms of the way technique and sort of resolution of projects is articulated, I miss the School of Architecture at times. But what I really enjoy about being in the Visual Arts department at UCSD mm-hmm. is, if anything, there is a more critical context to debate and to approach many of the issues, obviously, that we are trying to tackle in more conceptual ways. Mm-hmm. And so there is a richer, more interdisciplinary conversation. Mm-hmm. So it's a give and take a bit, but nevertheless, I find myself being the only architect, not only in the visual arts, but in the whole campus. And so it's but that has been a fantastic opportunity to advance the research mm-hmm. that I've been trying to mm-hmm. Develop in the last years in the context of the border. So that's what really began to make sense, not only for me, but also for the Visual Arts Department, as it began to open up itself, seeking other ways of speaking of practice, in a sense, seeking other modes of practice that might not be sort of located in the specialization of particular categories that are compartmentalized within the curriculum from, let's say, studio base or media or installation and so on, but seeking more mediating type of practices that could really begin to straddle those categorizations. And so the effort in the Visual Arts Department began to open up what we ended up calling public culture and urbanization, in a sense. So really another way of talking about social practice, in a sense. But fundamentally opening up a more critical interface between art practice and the city. And the territory at large, because obviously this is a border territory where I work. And so understanding the border as a fundamental laboratory, the kind of socioeconomic and political pressing realities that are inscribed in that territory, serving as the backdrop to rethink artistic practice, basically, to reconnect our process with very specific issues in the construction of the city. So I'm saying this because obviously the city has always been the fertile laboratory for art, it's the site of experimentation, but for some reason in the last decades, I think artists and we were distant, I think, from understanding the complexities that construct the city. Not only that, but also unable at times to intervene in more critical ways in reframing public space or the types of economic and political forces that were defining the city in front of our very eyes, but I guess we were somewhere else. So I think this reconnection of artistic experimentation, social responsibility, and the construction of the environment, I think, is what opened up the possibility at UCSD.
Sure. And when you're talking about this kind of conceptual dimension that allows for possibilities of experimentation, it seems like part of your practice involves research, as you mentioned, and then there's an aspect of design, and then an aspect of actual production. And I'm wondering how those three modes function for you in your practice.
Yes, fantastic question. It's interesting because at a time when design is becoming an ubiquitous type of concept, or at least term that is always invoked by many in the university. I mean, at least in my campus, they are trying to really mobilize what is called a kind of design initiative. And sometimes as artists we tend to be a little bit scared of the word design because we might equate it too quickly with industrial design or commercial design, or even though that definitely needs to be offered to our students. But I feel that design opens up maybe a more conceptual dimension that has to do with understanding process. And times, even though many of our practices might be process-based, I think that there is still a lot to be said about what process can, in a kind of operational way, open up as a site of intervention. Much of my interest has been to, in fact, propose, and this is a lot of my teaching at UCSD, that our practices themselves are a site of intervention in reorganizing methodological processes, understanding the institutional mechanisms that we are trying to engage, articulating new possibilities of understanding audience and interfaces with communities, material, the kind of shifting of material culture. In other words, the kind of the plethora of like issues that orbit around us as artists, and at times are not, we cannot manage that complexity because we tend to sort of gravitate around one singular topic or predilection or niche. But I think the possibility of managing that complexity and organizing those flows and information is really a design act. And so that's when obviously things begin to come together. The conceptual approach, obviously, the visualization of process, and obviously the material consequences of all of that. So many times, I don't know about here in the school, but many times we tend to give priority to the technique and the medium as a locus, to understand what is our specialization, instead of really looking at the issues and really critically engaging the issues. That might be a way of reorganizing the media or the medium. So it's a process-based, more critical thinking, conceptual approach that is linked to design and therefore to new aesthetics or new material practices.
I think I was telling you earlier that in this undergraduate class that I'm teaching, we read a couple of interviews and texts that you had written, and this notion of the border zone comes up not just in terms of nationality, like San Diego, Tijuana, but even this border zones between media or different academic departments, or ways of thinking about one thing as being necessarily separate from another, that say like research and design. I wonder how, a lot of what you've been talking about has to do with the way that the program and your teaching at UCSD functions. How does your pedagogy relate to a kind of professional practice that you do separate from the university? Are they distinct in some way? Do they feed one another, or?
Yes. Well, I mean, finally, I think I'm really excited that finally I've been connecting the dots, as you say. The amazing possibility of being in a research institution is that it enables the space, obviously, to articulate the investigation of the border region that has been important to me even further, but also connecting research, which unavoidably must be part, obviously, of our work, because it's not only, obviously, as somebody mentioned, it's not only being an artist is not only about planting things in the world, but it's also about constructing discourse, and that has been essential in this new period in my teaching, and for all of us in that way. But when an institution supports that possibility of constructing knowledge, from which then to produce new pedagogical procedures that can then connect to practice. So this triangulation of obviously research, pedagogy or education and practice is finally making sense. I founded the Center for Urban Ecologies within the Visual Arts Department to in fact do that. I'm saying also this in the context of education because not only our practices must be a site of intervention to keep ourselves in check in the context of challenging our own cliches, but I think also in the way we teach. I mean, obviously, as for example, notions of public space begin to shift. I've been interested, for example, of introducing the visual artist in my department to other modalities of intervention. In the past, provocatively, I tell my students, as artists, we become, unfortunately, the decorators of the screw-ups of bad planning, and we have not really entered into the political and economic frameworks that are inscribed in the territory. So many of the courses that I teach in the context of public space begin with the recognition of political power and economic power inscribed in the areas of intervention, so that the students can begin to gain knowledge, again, of the kind of complexity that makes that very thick plane of conditions that the city is. And also the idea that maybe interventions into public space might not be via objects or metaphorical tropes, materialized into space in the context of site specificity, but that it might be intervening more conceptually in the reorganization of policy, economic frameworks, and even new modalities of participatory practices with, co-producing with communities and so on. So expanding our ways of understanding public space, that has opened up a new pedagogical dimension for me. Because then we would have to figure out what are the tools of investigation, how do we approach this with the students, and so on. So again, the issue is the research connects to new forms of education, I think, that have implications in the construction of our own practices.
So this is kind of a two-part question. Basically, San Diego Tijuana is a very specific local place, a particular local border zone, but you also travel quite a bit and have done projects around the world that have relationships to those tendencies. So I'm wondering, first of all, about this sort of general notion of sort of the local versus global, but also specifically in terms of the U.S.-Mexico border, like Texas also has a relationship to the U.S.-Mexico border. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of the sort of similarities or differences that might exist between the sort of California-Texas border and the California-Mexico border and the Texas-Mexico border.
Yes. Well, obviously, one of the challenges is how we can fly and walk simultaneously. I mean, in a sense, it's difficult, but I think that at times in my interface, in relationship with my students in the conversation, sometimes I think there is, for some reason, the inability, and I don't know if this has to do with the kind of mediocre education in the elementary system here in this country, but the lack of associative intelligence in the possibility of simultaneously look at macro and micro conditions, abstract, conceptual, and very specific, concrete, ways of intervening, and how to constantly oscillate back and forth. Epistemologically, that opens up a really interesting way of rethinking the environment and the territory. But at the end of the day, for me, the issue, even though I'm interested in the relationship, more sort of critical ways of reading that relationship between the global and the local, between the abstract and the specific. But I really have devoted my thinking to the local. I mean, to really opening up the very specific, the specificity of the political in this very specific place. And but with the idea that the types of conditions that are embedded in that specificity could become material for the artist. Is not until we understand the very particular policies, the very particular, again, economic frameworks, the political representation, the forces that really affect this very specific place, until we gain a knowledge of that specificity. It's difficult to speak of other scales. So yes, I've been arguing that a point of departure is to really visualize that specificity and enable those conditions to be materials. In my case as an architect, for example, I've been arguing that it's difficult to advance, for example, conditions of design when it comes to housing without advancing housing policy or without advancing housing economy. And so I've been trying to gain knowledge of very specific local processes that have prevented affordability. Obviously, that pertains to state and federal scales. But anyway, the point is that inscribing our practice in the local, but simultaneously understanding how that can scale up and touch other environments. And that's the discovery I made at some point when I connected the San Diego-Tijuana border with the rest of the world. It was a very intuitive exercise. I asked myself what would happen if I was to stretch a line across a world atlas, stretching it from San Diego-Tijuana. I was hugely surprised that it is in the same corridor between the 30 to 35th degrees north parallel, connecting itself with the Ceuta and Melilla border, which is the main funnel of migration from North Africa into Europe, and even the Israeli-Palestinian border. So I ended up calling that the political equator, because it really linked all these intensive, critical geographies of conflict in the world. So then it began to really make sense that I could be arguing, my position was, let's understand the marginalized communities that flank this border, this specific border, and by doing that, we might be able to enable them as laboratories to think global governance.
Sure.
Because obviously those other checkpoints might be made of very different histories and specific relations across institutions, but at the end of the day, they also are made of the same types of conflicts across socioeconomic inequality, across power relations, issues of migration, and so on. So yes, that began to open up a more comprehensive way of looking more critically at the global, and that pertains to the rest of the continental U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, the cities that flank the two sides and that really create this sort of necklace of checkpoints across the border, they emerge from very different histories. I mean, obviously the Texas Mexico border, many of these cities, there are border cities from the beginning. The city existed and the border came to divide them. In the case of Tijuana, San Diego, the two cities from the beginning grew separately from each other. So there are differences, but at the same time, obviously there are similarities in the way natural, social, economic systems collide, cross-border natural systems and socioeconomic codependencies collide with the imposed politics of surveillance at this moment and so on. So yes, it's an interesting project. I've been focusing in Tijuana, San Diego, but I think it is a larger, obviously, continental U.S.-Mexico border that is definitely the territory.
It's interesting, this idea of taking the border outward, because it sort of starts from a visual, from a kind of just a line, a line on a map. So it's a kind of visual speculation that then leads into all these kind of socio-political, socio-economic relationships that move across the globe.
I'm glad you're saying that, because I've been criticized, even though the political equator became a very dramatic diagram for my own practice as a point of entry into, again, producing new correspondences critically between the local and the global. But some people would argue, well, it's not a flat line. You know, it's obviously that's the case. It's just a point of entry to understand or to re-engage a more dialectical dimension between us and them. And obviously, we know that those categories are not black and white. But at the same time, it became a point of entry into the understanding that it was geographies of conflict, and conflict itself, urban conflict, what would be the fertile kind of territory for my practice, and that it was communities that were defined by that conflict across the world, not necessarily flanking that exact border, global border, but that are distributed in a more rhizomatic way all over the world. But then I understood then, for my own sort of process, that it was territorial conflict, what would be the basis of my investigation.
Yeah, because even the border that you were talking about, like the difference between the Texas-Mexico border versus the California-Mexico border, and its history being different in the way a line cuts through a city, those lines are cut through sometimes by literally a pen on a map. So that there can be actually this sort of arbitrary visual materiality that sort of constructs something through territory that has social and political consequences.
Yes, and it's precisely that, because there is obviously a physical concreteness of the border, but at the same time, the conditions that produce that border, whether institutional systems or moral judgments or conceptual types of conditions, that border obviously is reproduced ad infinitum, almost everywhere. And this is what at times I tell my students, that while the border is there and we must understand it as a kind of emblem of today's crisis, that border is invisibly replicated across our cities everywhere in the world. The borders that divide communities, jurisdictions, and ultimately the border between institutions at this very moment.
So how do you proceed with the research, or how do you begin the process of research when you're looking into whether it's housing policy or sort of the facts on the ground?
Well, it's what I began to call unavoidable detours. that sometimes we want to focus on one thing, but in order to get to that thing, obviously we have to maybe take a detour in order to contact the other domains that really have been peripheral to that very topic that we want to address, but that at the end of the day are more primary. So, for example, in Tijuana, one of the projects which engage the slums in Tijuana, and as an architect, I would want to just right away go to the slum to build housing for the poor.
Sure.
I obviously begin to understand that building housing is not the solution necessarily, even though we must do that. But in order to engage the issues more fundamentally in the context of informal urbanization in those slums in Tijuana, I had to go to the factories that surround, obviously, those slums, because there is a role they play in the explosion of those environments, in the capitalizing of cheap labor and so on, and themselves become sites of intervention. So the same goes for issues of housing, for example, where in order to really get to designing the types of spaces that could be a lot more inclusive in democratizing urban development, we would have to contact again the urban policies that have prevented particular mixed uses or densities, or the financial mechanisms that have prevented communities from developing their own housing. So the sites of intervention are not necessarily the site-specific issue, but the institutions that surround that issue, and the reorganization of those institutions, and probably in a more, I don't want to say conciliatory way, but because it's not about appeasement here, but it's about being more critical in engaging the visualization of the stakeholders that are really accountable, that must be accountable for the crisis. So what I'm trying to say is that began to open up a new dimension for my practice as a facilitator of new critical interfaces across institutions and communities, to really produce a new process, let's say, of engagement. In fact, one of the most recent projects at this moment has to do with opening a space of research inside the municipality of San Diego. So I was tapped by the former mayor of San Diego to begin what we called an incubator for civic imagination inside city management, to produce a collaborative model of government and really engage sort of the notion of citizenship culture in a sense, and to really begin questioning some faulty urban policies. In other words, really bring the level of creativity that we have in the school of visual arts into city management. So the relationship of that space in government, the university, and some of the community-based projects I've been working across the border now begins to make a lot more sense. And so one project that I'm initiating at this moment is to produce in collaboration with a colleague of mine at UCSD, who is the director of the Center on Global Justice, Fona Foreman. We are bringing Antanas Mokus, who is the former mayor of Bogota, and his foundation, to perform what will be the first binational citizenship culture survey, which is basically an instrument that measures public trust and opens the question of a cross-border public. What are the common interests? What are the issues of concern between these two cities, and the issues that these two municipalities must be accountable to engage in the next years as their destinies are intertwined, even though up to now every single urban policy between these two cities is completely fragmented. And so it becomes a very interesting aspect of my practice, is how to intervene in the construction of protocols that can bring levels of accountability to institutions. So in this case, across the border, I think is the most fundamental point of departure, is that this document that we will generate will become an MOU of sorts, a kind of cross-border agreement between the two municipalities to identify a series of very critical geographies within the border region to enable the specificity of those spaces and their needs to inspire the transformation of urban policy across the border. So again, is once more, as an artist, we become a little bit of cultural traffickers, you know, as we possibly open up new types of institutional relations, not only from the top down, but primarily in the context of their responsibility to communities and back. And this has been essential for my work, is to engage what I call the crisis of knowledge transfer between the bottom up and the top down and so on. So these protocols are really reframing that type of relationship between institutions and communities across the border.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing more at your lecture tonight.
Thank you.